It's been 1 year since the Voice referendum, when the overwhelming majority of Australians voted no to the Voice. And so the usual suspects have come out trying to rewrite history and trying to blame shift for why the Voice so spectacularly failed, blaming so-called misinformation for the Voice going down. But here's the real truth. The Voice was a terrible idea that was marketed terribly. So in this video, I want to highlight precisely why the Voice failed, and to rebut the self-pitying, self-serving narratives that some Yes campaigners are now wheeling out. And in short, the Voice was bad policy and it should have failed, as it rightly did. Now let's start off with the issues of policy. The overarching issue that the Voice was simply bad. It was inherently racially discriminatory and therefore, to my mind, was racist. This is because the Voice body would have been the only constitutionally recognised body that would have had the right to make representations to the Parliament and to the government, and the Voice would have been racially derived. So let's dig into why exactly that is truly bad. First, no other Australian would have such a right. Second, the right to make representations implies a right to be consulted in order so that they can be informed to make those representations. Third, this therefore gives rise to litigation rights and the ability to allege that those representations were not properly considered, or that the consultation was inadequate. Therefore, one would be giving rights to the Voice that no other Australian would have. This therefore would give rights based on an individual's race. It would therefore be racially divisive. And let's be very clear about this. If you're the only person in the room, that gives you constructive power. The Voice would be the only body that would need to be consulted or would need to be able to make representations. Therefore, the Voice would have constructive power. If they are the only person in the room, the Voice could trample over everyone else. Therefore, the Voice would have given power to one group on the basis of race. It therefore would be racially discriminatory. And this is an inherent policy weakness behind it, and to my mind is the main reason the Voice failed. People simply saw that it was discriminatory. The next issue, of course, is that the Voice campaigners did a bad job selling this truly bad policy. And they did this in several truly spectacularly awful ways, which range from gaslighting through to simply spreading misinformation through to bullying. And overall, Australians simply got sick of it and they saw through the whole issue. There was the bullying, calling people racist or chicken littles if they raised questions. This was endemic in the Voice campaign. Anthony Albanese, for example, called people chicken littles if they raised questions and had doubts and fears about what the Voice might lead to. And indeed, the Voice, given the power that it might have, could easily push for things such as reparations or for treaty or for ever more concessions. However, Anthony Albanese simply disparaged people that raised this. Then you had the old issue that people were alleged to be racist if they were voting against the Voice, when indeed the Voice itself was in fact the racist proposal. It was hypocrisy in the extreme. It was condescending and it was misleading. And this leads me to the massive amounts of misinformation from the Yes campaign. There were inaccurate claims that the Voice would simply be advisory when, as outlined, it would have constructive power. There was the absurd fight over the Uluru Statement, which gave rise to the Voice and was the document that really inspired the Voice to be gotten off the ground. Now that Uluru Statement, whether in the 1-page form or the 26-page form, called for the Voice, it called for Makarrata, and it called for a treaty. There was a fight about exactly what the words in the Uluru Statement meant, and whether the Uluru Statement was 1 page or 26 pages. But in reality, it didn't really matter, because that 1 page had very vague words that required definition, and therefore people need to look for what a treaty would involve, and when people looked, they didn't like what they saw. Which is why you had people like Megan Davis trying to claim that the background documents underlying the Uluru Statement simply were not something that were part of the Uluru Statement and should be discarded, and anyone who raised them was indeed spreading misinformation themselves. It was gaslighting. The Voice campaign spread misinformation and misled people continually. Then you had Mark Dreyfus's second reading speech, which spread inaccuracy from the very beginning. He claimed that the Voice would only be able to talk to matters that differently affected Indigenous Australians. That was simply false, because the referendum text said nothing of the sort. Or, as I have talked about before, the simply false claim from the Uluru Dialogue, which was an institute promoting the Voice, that the Voice body would be equally comprised of men and women, or have representation from regional communities, or be voted upon, or any among of those things. But that was simply a false statement, because none of those things had been determined. We had no legislation indicating how the voice would be made up or what its specific additional powers would be, and therefore any claims of that nature were simply misinformation. Then there was the claim that the vast majority of Indigenous Australians wanted the voice. Now that may or may not be true, but it is a little bit beside the point, because what matters is whether Australians want the voice, not whether a subset of Australians want the voice. And I would also point out that I dare say a number of Indigenous Australians were concerned about the activists taking control of the voice and trampling over their specific interests. The Voice campaign was replete with misinformation from the yes side of the campaign. And indeed, it was gaslighting and yet more misinformation when they claim that the no side was spreading misinformation when they themselves were on the forefront of doing exactly that. In essence, if anyone was spreading misinformation, it was the Yes campaign. And people saw through this misinformation, and when they saw the misinformation being spread, and they saw the inconsistent statements from the Voice campaigners, people were wondering whether they're simply being misled, whether the wool was being pulled over their eyes, and whether they could really trust the Voice campaigners, and indeed whether they could really trust the Voice if it were ultimately going to come into being. This therefore was one of the core reasons the Voice sunk. And this led to a related issue. The Yes campaign simply would not answer people's genuine concerns. When people asked, what would the Voice try to achieve? And would the Voice try to achieve things such as treaty further down the track, which are even more unpalatable than the Voice ever was? They'd simply be dismissed and wiped away, and told that they were really focusing on things that weren't in fact an issue. But the Uluru Statement stated that the Voice was simply the first step toward a treaty. Therefore, it was right for people to be asking these questions, but those questions were simply dismissively waved away. The Yes campaign, therefore, kept trying to obfuscate over their future plans. And people saw the obfuscation because they saw the non-answers to their genuine, very real concerns. And the inability to deal with these meant that people simply didn't trust the Yes side of the campaign. I would posit that it was misinformation from the Yes campaign and the fact that the Voice proposal in itself was inherently discriminatory and racist that led to it failing. But this hasn't stopped politicians and advocates pushing ahead with things such as treaty. As I've talked about before, Chris Minns is trying to have a treaty in New South Wales. Queensland has been pursuing this. Victoria has also been pushing for a treaty. But people simply don't want this. People don't want the Voice. They don't want the treaty. People voted against the Voice overwhelmingly. The treaty is an order of magnitude worse than the Voice. It beggars belief that people would want a treaty when they didn't want a voice to begin with. But politicians keep pushing ahead with all of this that we don't want. And politicians need to be told to stop because they aren't acting in voters' interests. They're acting their own interests, that appears, trying to either appeal to niche parts of the electorate or trying to appeal to trendy inner-city crowds so they can be invited to trendy inner-city parties or have a cushy job once they leave politics. Whatever is the case, the Yes campaign squandered massive resources. They had every advantage in the world. They had the support of all major corporations. They had massive amounts of funding. They had the support of the sitting government. And yet they still failed. The Voice was still voted against overwhelmingly. But they don't get the message. Despite having every advantage in the world, the Voice failed. Clearly that should demonstrate that people don't want this. But many of the Yes campaigners can't get that through their heads. But let me know your thoughts about why the Voice failed and what should happen going forward. I'd be interested to hear what you think in the comments below.